All right, good morning, folks. I'll let our attendees trickle in here and then we'll go ahead and get started. Once we see that number of attendees kind of stop increasing, we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. All right, I think we're at that point. So good morning and welcome to our PFAS discussion webinar featuring Nancy McBrady, Bureau Director of the Agriculture, Food and Rural Resources Bureau at the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry. Also with Susanne Miller, Bureau Director of the Remediation and Waste Management Bureau at the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, as well as Dr. Andrew Smith, the State Toxicologist and Manager of the Environmental and Occupational Health Program at the Maine Center for Disease Control and Prevention. The event is presented as part of our Food for Thought Forum webinar series. My name is Christine Cummings. I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Grocers and Food Producers Association. We're pleased to be co-hosting this morning's webinar with our partners at the Retail Association of Maine. We're thankful for the expertise our presenters can share with us this morning. We look forward to them providing an update to our retailers, food producers, and industry partners as to the current lay of the land in regard to PFAS. First, we'd like to take a moment to recognize today's series sponsors who have invested and supported the work of the Retail Association of Maine and the Maine Grocers and Food Producers Association. So Amy, if you can just hit the next slide for us and go and view our sponsors. All right, if not, I can certainly read through them. A big thank you to Hannaford Supermarkets, Poland Spring, Shaw's Supermarkets, Associated Grocers of New England, Bizzuto's, Altria, and Pepsi. And I'll hand it over to our co-host, Curtis.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Curtis Picard, President and CEO of the Retail Association of Maine. I'd like to also extend a warm welcome to this morning's presenters. We appreciate you taking the time to talk about this rapidly emerging and time-consuming issue. A few procedural notes before we start. First, all attendees are muted, so we won't hear each other's background noise and will remain muted throughout the webinar. We will have a question and answer period at the conclusion of the presentation. To ask a question at any point during the presentation, simply move your mouse towards the bottom of your screen, and within the black bar, there is a white Q&A icon. You can type your question in the box and click send. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be available after the event for interested participants to revisit. I'll ask each presenter to introduce themselves before the start of their presentations. With that, again, welcome to the Food for Thought Forum webinar series. Now let's begin. Nancy, we'll turn it over to you to get started, recognizing there are some public hearings today starting at 9 that you may need to jump over to, and then we'll look to Susanne, followed by Dr. Smith. So welcome, Nancy.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me get everything set up. All right. Is that in presentation mode? Just looking for a quick nod from folks that you all can see that. Yes. Okay, terrific. So good morning, everybody. My name is Nancy McBrady. I'm the Bureau Director at the Bureau of Agriculture, Food and Rural Resources within the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry. And I anticipate that we have a number of folks who have heard somewhat about PFAS, some more than others. And it is a complicated and nuanced subject that one webinar, of course, is not enough to really dive into with a lot of ability to give you a fulsome understanding. But that said, I will certainly give you as best a ground baseline introduction into PFAS and where we're finding them within the state of Maine, particularly for agriculture, and then what the Department of Agriculture is doing as a response to assist those farmers who are impacted. And then I'm going to take it a step back and talk more broadly about what we're seeing this with regard to Maine food overall and impacts potentially to our reputation and branding, which I know you all are very concerned about. We are as well, but I want you to hopefully come away with a better understanding of why those concerns can be adjusted. And always, if anyone has further questions, we are certainly welcome to meet with you independently and answer questions as well. So with that, let's do a very quick intro into what is PFAS. PFAS are actually, it's the acronym for a large group of synthetic fluorinated chemicals. They, due to their construct, do not break down in the environment readily, and in fact have been deemed, forever chemicals because of how they can persist in the environment. We are dealing with this issue because PFAS chemicals are extremely useful. They have been widely used in products throughout the country and internationally since the 1940s. Examples of them are clothing and textiles, waterproofed clothing and textiles in particular, treated furniture fabric or rugs, carpeting, food packaging. Think about popcorn, microwave popcorn, or the wrappers for hamburgers, our cookware, our electronics, it's in makeup, it's everywhere, unfortunately. And they're there because they resist water, stains, heat, and grease. The impacts to PFAS are, as listed here, a number of things ranging from increased cholesterol levels all the way down to increased risk of particular types of cancer. And research is still digging into this and understanding those linkages. So it is something that we need to look at very carefully. We are finding PFAS in agriculture due to the life cycle of these chemicals. Land spreading of treated municipal waste, right down here, was permitted through a program at the Department of Environmental Protection, as well as departments of environmental protection across the country, throughout as well the last number of decades. Treated waste actually is a type of fertilizer that provides fields with nutrients and therefore was attractive to members of the agricultural community to utilize on their fields. In 2016, due to some ancillary water quality testing, there was a dairy farm in Arundel, Maine that had its milk tested, and those results were deemed to exceed an action level for a particular type of PFAS chemical called PFOS. That action level was created by Maine CDC and allows us to understand at present what the level of concern is for PFAS in milk, and that is 210 parts per trillion at the moment. Just very briefly, the new administration in 2019 put together a task force where members really dug into the issue of PFAS within Maine and made recommendations regarding wanting to understand drinking water impacts and where PFAS would be found in the environment. And Director Miller is going to be speaking to that in a moment. The Department of Agriculture also did some retail milk testing 3 times across the state to understand whether there might be PFAS found within the milk aggregate. We were able, based on that retail testing, to actually find a farm in Fairfield with very high numbers of milk, and we have since worked with them, as well as a third farm tied to that investigation. Director Miller is going to talk to you about a new law that is in effect, whereby DEP is now testing across the state to understand impacts of sludge or septage application. And I want to underscore that the work of the department is done in concert with our colleagues at the Department of Environmental Protection and Maine CDC. That is why when there are presentations on PFAS, generally all 3 of our departments are represented, because there is no one department that has all the answers from an agricultural perspective We certainly can be on the ground and help there, but we need our colleagues at CDC to help us interpret some of the data that we find. And certainly with DEP, there are cross-cutting nation and issues that we need to work together on. We have been very fortunate to collaborate with a lot of other entities within the state of Maine, including University of Maine Cooperative Extension and MOFGA. In particular, we worked with them around with some small research projects, and we're further trying to outline priority areas for future agriculturally related PFAS research as well. Also just want to mention Maine Farmland Trust, the Farmers and Ranchers Stress Assistance Network, others. There really is a cohort of people throughout the state of Maine who are digging in and working together to find solutions and support assistance to impacted individuals. So what happens when a farm is found? Folks really do need to understand that our goal from the department's perspective is to help a farm identify the sources of contamination on their site and determine whether or not it's possible to reduce or eliminate PFAS in their impacted products. It is so important to see if we can find a way for this farm to remain viable, but it takes a lot of coordination and work and testing. So first and foremost, there has to be sort of a forensic understanding of what's happening at that farm. What was the spreading history, if known? Where, when, how much? What were they growing then? What are they growing now? If there are livestock involved, is the feed coming from the farm? Is it being supplemented from off-farm? Did that off-farm location also spread biosolids? There's a lot of detective work that has to happen to get the lay of the land. And so data collection is key. We fortunately received legislative support, financial support last session, which allows us to pay for comprehensive sampling at farms. And that sampling is reoccurring, especially if it's looking at milk and whether it's starting to go down. Also feed, soil, meat, and livestock. Every farm is different. The blueprint starts off with, what we want to do, and then it deviates and adjusts because, again, every farm has a different history and different business plans. We then work with the producers to interpret the data. As I mentioned, CDC is readily involved with that process. And then ultimately, we try to use that data to make management recommendations. Should people turn away from hay and instead start growing corn, for instance, because we understand that corn is more tolerant of PFAS and the ultimate corn kernels often are non-detect. And I also want to stress the point that we have had progress in working with the dairy farm in drastically reducing the level of PFOS in that producer's milk. So we are learning what it takes, including time and effort and funding, to get people to the other side of this. We have the funding, like I mentioned, to pay for testing. We also are going to be able to reimburse farms if they independently tested, if they meet some criteria there. We can put in a water filtration system for a farm in some instances. And we are currently building out a broader program that is going to provide income support payments to impacted farms who ultimately lose their revenue by virtue of not being able to sell their impacted products for a while. And we understand how devastating that is. We're also building our staff capacity at the department. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of people to be out in the field and working with these farms. So, pausing there, I want to address what this all means, if we can even say, to Maine's food economy and reputation. I understand that there's a lot of concern around PFAS and Maine agriculture, and there has been a lot of alarming press and news about all of this. And there's a couple things that I just want to stress here, and that PFAS is not a Maine specific issue. We happen to be out front. We happen to be a state that is taking responsibility and leaning into this, but we are not the only state that had biosolid programs. That was done across the country as well. 30 plus states are paying attention, and they're considering PFAS legislation as well. And just recently in January, Michigan also issued a beef consumption advisory for one of its producers. So I certainly do see, unfortunately, that others will be joining us in this effort. But I think that will help broaden the understanding that this is not specific to our farmers and what they did, not knowing that biosolids contain PFAS, of course. And so I do predict that in time there will be a better and broader understanding across the states about what may be happening within their food economy. Our reputation, of course, is high quality, safe food stewards of our natural resources, supporting local, and that should continue. We have over 7,000 farms in this state. As Susanne Miller will explain in a moment, we have historical records that indicate 700 sites may have spread that needs to be investigated, see where that radiates out to. But ultimately, we are not going to be having this show up at every single farm, but it takes that detective work to piece it all together and lay out that picture, which we are doing and actually have to do within a rather truncated period of time. We also understand that PFAS isn't necessarily forever. We're learning a lot about what crops are tolerant, and when I say tolerant, actually can grow in PFAS impacted soils and yet be non-detect or extremely low in their PFAS values. That's going to take a lot of work in explaining that to the general consumer, but it really does need to be teased out that just because spreading may have occurred doesn't mean there was a problem. And I think ultimately, this is somewhat cold comfort because it's going to take a while, but when we get through this, we are going to have a state that has a roadmap and an understanding of the safety of our ag producing lands and the products from them. And no other state is going to have that. And so there is a benefit that we just have to reach in order to get to that other side. So it is a very nuanced, complicated subject. Education and conversations like this are key. The communications by our department, by CDC and DEP, I think always are going to need to be tweaked and enhanced in order to get this message across. Right now, we are really much in the thick of standing everything up and getting our ground game for helping the farmers first and foremost. But ultimately, we do understand the responsibility that we have to ensure that people understand what we're doing, why we're doing, and why we believe this is not a statewide, all food is suspect situation. And in fact, we're going to be able to have data and a better understanding of where we stand in a relatively short period of time. So with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to Director Miller. Look forward to answering some questions in a bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Brady. I am going to get my program up and running. Okay. So just a quick introduction. I'm Susanne Miller. I am the Director for the Bureau of Remediation and Waste Management at Maine DEP. We have several bureaus at the department working on PFAS, but the Bureau of Remediation and Waste Management was the bureau that started the work in this area. And so we tend to be doing a lot of the work. And so I'll get to that in just a second. But to get started, I wanted to just kind of recap what Nancy had said about what are PFAS and where are they. We know that, again, they're a chemical class that has at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom, and that's by definition in Maine statute. PFAS are found in a lot of different locations in Maine. And let me just run through them because Director Brady focused on agriculture, which we're going to focus on more throughout the rest of this presentation. But I want to just mention that PFAS are also found in relation to landfills. Landfill leachate tends to have PFAS, and it gets there not just from industrial inputs, but also from, throwing away and disposal of consumer products, or using items that have PFAS in them and having water go down, down the drain, which ultimately leads to our wastewater treatment and may ultimately end up at a landfill. So landfills are an area where we're finding PFAS. As Director McBrady said, sludge and septic land application sites in Maine. We also have contaminated sites in Maine, some remediation sites. Some of them are federal, some of them are state, and we've found PFAS there. And a lot of times that has to do with the release of AFFF foam, which is a firefighting foam that contains PFAS. So the key guidelines and regulations we're working with right now in Maine are that the last legislative session in June of 2021, a public resolve became enacted, which set a Maine drinking water interim standard at 20 parts per trillion for the sum of 6 PFAS. What that means is that this standard is in place until such time as the drinking water program creates a new level that is, incorporated into their rules. Just want to go back to that for a second, because that means that, this level could change in the future. It may or it may not. It's hard to tell at this point. In addition, as Director McBrady mentioned, the department, in conjunction with help from both the Department of Agriculture and the Maine CDC, developed screening guidelines. Maine currently has screening levels for soils, recreational fishing, milk, beef, dairy, and also looking at hay to corn pathway to dairy. We don't have screening levels at this time for every agricultural product. So for example, vegetables, we don't have screening levels for at this point in time. Dr. Smith might be able to talk a little bit more about what the path forward may be on developing new screening levels, but at this time, this is what we have to work with, and this is what we're using as we make decisions and move forward with our programs. So as Director McBrady mentioned, the Department of Environmental Protection has been charged by the legislature with conducting a comprehensive soil and groundwater investigation. Chapter 478, public law, last session became effective in October. It's called an Act to Investigate PFAS Substance Contamination of Land and Groundwater. So this law requires the DEP to go out and conduct soil and water investigations throughout the state based on areas where there might be contamination that came from the application of sludge or septic application. So this is very much different than PFAS that comes from, say, like a landfill leachate or from a remediation site. This is focused specifically on sludge or septic application. And that's why a lot of the results that we're working with as we conduct this investigation primarily seem to fall on the agriculture community, because it was primarily the agriculture community that benefited from the land application of sludge as part of a licensing process. So how is this investigation going to work? So first of all, just want to mention that as Director McBrady mentioned, at the outset, the DEP identified about 700 sites where sludge and septic might have been applied throughout the state. And this is based on licenses that we had, licensing information. And how it worked is that just because a license said that sludge or septic was allowed to be applied, doesn't necessarily mean that it was applied. So it's not always easy to figure out what was actually applied. That information is not in the actual license itself. It's usually in annual reports, and not all of the annual reports are equal. And when you're talking, over the course of several decades, it's a lot of documents to look through, a lot of reports to look through to try to find out where sludge was applied. And because it's so difficult to find information, we've definitely relied on the anecdotal knowledge and information we've had from our counterparts over at the Department of Ag, and also the farms, and also community members. We're learning a lot from the community, and we really are thankful for that. So to get through 700 sites, I want to just clarify that each site isn't necessarily one field or one location. Sites based on these licenses really maybe multiple fields. A lot of times a farm will use 10 or so fields for its operations, not necessarily just one. So a site would include all 10 of those fields and multiple samples at each field. In addition, that's just soil sampling. When you factor in water sampling, usually water is sampled surrounding each of those site locations by homeowners or groundwater wells that are relatively close by. So we usually start at 1,000 feet, then we expand to a half mile, and then as needed, we'll continue to expand out as we find results that exceed the interim drinking water standard. So we started this investigation in December. We did get some soil sampling done in December, but really we had to put that on hold because of the weather. It's really difficult and challenging to get good soil samples when the ground is frozen, when there's snow and water can get into the sample. So we're going to reboot that process probably in April as the ground thaws. We already have some locations scheduled for soil sampling as early as April, and then we'll go full bore ahead in the summer. But in the wintertime, we have been focusing on water sampling. And I'll tell you in a minute what we're learning from that, that data, but we are moving forward in 34 communities, which we identified as the top tier. Tier 1 sites are the top tier. They're what the department has identified as the highest risk. Primarily, that's where a site was known to have spread or thought to have spread sludge that might have PFAS as an input, where there was 10,000 cubic yards or more spread in a given location, and where there's known receptors, groundwater wells nearby. Tier 2 sites are between 5 and 10,000 cubic yards spread at a given site. Tier 3 sites under 5,000 cubic yards, and Tier 4 sites are sites where we're still trying to gather information and data from our records to find out, what was spread there, was something actually spread there, how much, in what location. So sort of Tier 4 is the unknown, and we're still working through that information. So we expect that the whole investigation is going to speed up as we gain more experience. We will also be getting more contracts in place to help. So that's contracts with consultants, more laboratories, more folks to do sampling of filtration systems once they're installed. As far as the investigation goes, it's difficult to know where we're going to need to expand our search. Some communities we're going to need to step out sampling, some communities we won't need to. We are moving as fast as possible. And I just want to remind everyone that the DEP's focus is very narrow. It's soil and water. We communicate and coordinate with our colleagues over at the Department of Agriculture to help farmers, but the department's priority is to ensure that everybody has clean water to drink. And so our focus is soil and groundwater, and we use that information to ensure clean water is provided for everybody. The Department of Agriculture then steps in and works with farms to help with the agricultural end. So for timelines required by the legislature, half of this investigation of all 700 sites needs to be completed by 24, and all must be completed by 2025. And just again, multiple samples are at each site, and often weather and other conditions can impact the pace as well. Just to go through the estimated timelines, we expect Tier 1 sites, the first 34 communities we identified, the Tier 1 sites in those communities to be done through 2023, Tier 2 sites 23 and 24, and then the rest to be done by 25. I want to just emphasize that just because a community has a tier, is listed in Tier 1, doesn't mean the entire community is going to be tested all at once. Some communities have Tier 1 sites and Tier 2 sites. So we will start with the Tier 1 sites, and after we're done with those, then we will we'll test the remaining sites in that community as we start the Tier 2 process. So the PFAS investigation process for DEP first begins with an in-depth review of project licenses and reports to just make sure we can identify where the land applications took place, so that we can be sure to really focus on the areas where there might be an impact. Our staff scientists then develop a sampling and analysis plan so that we collect data that's statistically useful and actually is helpful in terms of understanding the flow and movement of PFAS in the environment. We then contact landowners or homeowners to schedule sampling events. In some cases, some landowners don't particularly want the DEP to be on their property, but in other cases they do. So that's something that affects the pace of our investigation. Once we've scheduled sampling events, we coordinate with our colleagues over at the Department of Agriculture to make sure that we are able to help with any farm-specific considerations, with the Department of Agriculture taking the lead on that front. We then go on site, conduct sampling events, deliver the samples to the laboratory. We obtain and review the lab results for data quality and make sure there's no irregularities or problems with the data. From there, we contact the homeowner with lab results. And unfortunately, the timing between collecting the lab result and having a result to provide to the landowner often can take as long as a month. There is a shortage of some lab capacity to some degree. It's not just Maine that's using labs to obtain PFAS data. It's all 50 states at this point. And there are no labs in Maine that actually can do the processing for PFAS. It's all done out of state. So, you know, we're competing with the rest of the country on that front. Once we have delivered the results to landowners or homeowners, we then have our scientists look at the data to determine what the need is for stepping out additional sampling in that location. So they develop a new sampling and analysis plan. And also, we have to decide what are we going to do with the results. So if we know that there are elevated soil results, the Department of Agriculture will begin working in depth with landowners and farmers to make sure that you know, their needs are being met from an agriculture and products perspective. Where water results are elevated, the DEP or the Maine Drinking Water Program will ensure that clean drinking water is provided. The DEP will provide filtration systems to anybody who has a private groundwater well and their levels exceed 20 parts per trillion. In the interim, the DEP will provide bottled water. In some cases, it might make more sense based on where the location is to just hook a home up to a public water line. And in that case, if that were to happen, that would be a program administered by the Maine Drinking Water Program. So what have we learned so far? As of the end of last month, February 28th, we took over 600 water samples for private groundwater wells. 60% of the results fall under the state's interim drinking water standard. So that means 60% of the results we found are safe. However, there are a lot that are not. So that's 40% that are over the drinking water standard. And I don't think that's a number that, you know, is something to not be concerned about. It's definitely something to be concerned about. And 7% of the results that we tested are over 1,000 parts per trillion. And we've even found some at really unacceptably high levels at over, you know, the highest level we found so far was at 40,000 parts per trillion. So that's concerning, and that's something we definitely need to be cognizant of. And that's why the priority for Maine DEP is to make sure that those folks that are over 20 parts per trillion have access to clean drinking water. Right now, it's too soon for any statistics on soil sampling. Like I mentioned, that's on hold until the spring, but after this summer, we should have some more data on that and should be able to provide some more information on what the soils are actually looking like. As Director McBrady indicated, some landowners and farm owners and homeowners are choosing to self-test, and the results are varying. I think the key from all of the information that's floating around and from the data we've collected, the key thing to know is that PFAS contamination is not uniform throughout Maine. We anticipate that there's going to be some hot spots like the Fairfield area, but we don't anticipate that's going to be, that Maine itself is a big hot spot. So I think it's really important to take that context. So I'm going to shift gears now and talk a little bit about food packaging and the PFAS products legislation. So PFAS in food packaging was enacted into law in 2019. The whole premise of this is that DEP is allowed to develop some rules to prohibit the use of food packaging with intentionally introduced PFAS if there are safer alternatives available in sufficient quantities and at comparable cost. So at the time this passed back in 2019, the Department of Environmental Protection thought, well, let's piggyback onto a study that's already going on in Washington State. They're studying this, you know, we don't need to, you know, pay a consultant to do the same exact study. Let's see what they learn. And from there, we'll develop our own rules and go forward. So that study identified 4 key areas of food packaging where PFAS was found and where there might be alternatives available. That included wraps and liners, food boats, plates, and pizza boxes. However, that was done in 2020. And as we all know, the pandemic came along and the entire supply chain has changed. And so we are not certain now, based on sufficient quantity and comparable cost, if these 4 categories still make sense. So Maine is now in the process of, we're hoping to get a market assessment done on food packaging, and the RFP was posted in February. The plan is to have a report, hopefully completed by June, and hopefully rulemaking would follow sometime this summer. Rulemaking will be a major substantive rule, and we will definitely have stakeholder input, which will be critical to the process. So that's moving forward, and you should probably expect to hear more as the temperatures heat up. Also, PFAS in all products. So in last session, another law was enacted called an Act to Stop PFAS Substances Pollution. This basically requires manufacturers of any product out there in the entire universe of products that have intentionally added PFAS to notify the department by January 1st, 2023. Some manufacturers may be granted waivers and extensions, but I don't think we're quite ready to explain what that means just yet. Notifications are going to be collected and integrated using the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse. This is an entity that collects data of all sorts from states. It's something that could be shared with other states, and it basically is an existing data collection system, which takes some of the burden off of DEP staff to have to integrate, develop software, and collect all this information. So that's why we're using that. If you're interested, you can go visit that website to learn more. Any product where the DEP thinks there might be intentionally added PFAS, but there hasn't been a notification, the DEP may require that the manufacturer submit such a notification, submit a certification of a compliance, or demonstrate that there is or is not PFAS in the product. And I just want to mention here, I've got these little pictures on the side just to remind everybody. So PFAS isn't just in, sludge. It's also in all sorts of consumer products. Our Vortex rain gear, our Teflon pots and pans, nonstick pots and pans. It's in cosmetics, as we just talked about, food packaging, any stain resistant products. So there's a wide universe out there of PFAS containing products that we just don't know about yet. And that was the intent of this law, is to try to identify where it is so that it can be determined where does it really need to be. And that goes on to the rest of the requirements of this legislation. Some products that have intentionally added PFAS are going to be banned for sale and distribution beginning next January. That includes carpets and rugs, as well as fabric treatments. All products that have intentionally added PFAS, unless the PFAS is determined by rule to be unavoidable, are going to be banned for sale and distribution starting in January of 2030. Rules are going to be developed to determine what is banned and what is unavoidable use. Rules are going to be major substantive, and again, stakeholder input is going to be critical. And I will just leave this that DEP will be hiring a new staff person very quickly. I believe that the interviews have already taken place. That's going to be the key contact for administering this program. So that person's not in place yet, but they will be in place soon. And hopefully that person will be available to start, answering any questions that the general public and manufacturers may have about PFAS in products. So with that, I'm going to wrap things up. And if anybody has any questions for the DEP, we encourage you to send an email directly to our PFAS email, pfas.dep@maine.gov. It's the quickest way for us to get answers to you. And with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Smith.
Good morning, everybody. So let me also do the screen share and get set up. And then if somebody could just give me a verbal when you can see it.
Yep, we can see it.
Great, thank you. Switch to slide mode. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to provide a little bit more data around a bunch of the points that Nancy has already talked on. And I guess I should introduce myself first. So I'm Dr. Andy Smith. I'm the state toxicologist at the Maine CDC. I'm also manager of the Environmental and Occupational Health Program. So we're one of the primary groups of toxicologists, epidemiologists, and environmental health in the state, and have been fairly active on this issue since at least since 2016 with the first sort of milk and fish issues we encountered. What I'm going to do in my talk, I'm going to try to keep it brief to about 15 minutes at max, is put a little bit more visual detail around how we go about naming these chemicals, because you'll see me and others talking about individual ones. So I want you to have a little bit of image of what those look like. And it's not just me being cruel, forcing you to relive high school or college chemistry for a few moments. Then from there, I'll talk a little bit about what we know about our exposure to these chemicals. And I'll start first with what we know about exposure in our bodies, which is a good measure of all the various pathways that we get these exposed to these chemicals. Then from there, I'll talk a little bit about what FDA has found from sampling the national food supply. Put a little bit more detail around Nancy's mentioned of the Maine retail milk sampling, and then talk a little bit about one farm where we've seen milk levels high and then go low and what was involved in doing that. And then end with a bit of a discussion about what's out there for science to tell us about the uptake of these chemicals by produce, so vegetables, grains, etc. And that should tee us up then for questions. So that's kind of a roadmap. You've seen variations of this in the two preceding talks. So what I want you to focus on in this slide is that although there are hundreds and if not thousands of variations of these chemical structures, the ones we're mostly testing for, the ones we mostly know something about their toxicology and health effects, and the ones that we are currently seeing mostly in dairy or meat or vegetable products are going to be in the next two slides that I'm going to walk you through. So I just want you to get a sense of, you start with a basic chemical structure. If you think of octane and gasoline, it's just 8 carbons, all hydrogens, right? So what they're doing with these chemicals is they're replacing all the hydrogens or many of the hydrogens with a fluorine atom. That carbon-fluorine bond is extremely strong, hard to break down, which is what makes these so persistent. But then you'll notice at the end, they have this functional group which gives it some polarity. So therefore it has some ability to interact with water. And this is actually considered a carboxylic acid sort of group in the end. So one subfamily of this big family of PFAS chemicals, PFAS, perfluoroalkyl substances, are these carboxylates. And this one up here specifically with 8 carbons, 8 octa. So it's called perfluorooctanoic acid. We abbreviate it PFOA, PFOA. You could take 1 carbon away, you've got 7. It's now a hepta, 7. So that's perfluoroheptanoic acid. We abbreviate that PFHPA, small p. You could have, instead of taking 1 away, add 1, you've got 9. It's nona, PFNA. Add another one, you've got 10, deca, PFDA. So when you get lab results, whether it's on foods or water, etc., you'll often see list of chemicals like this. There are 6, 5, and 4 carbon versions of these same ones, as just an example of ones that we're running into in the environment. There's another sort of subfamily, which are pretty much the same, except instead of having that carboxylate on the end, they have this sulfonic acid group on the end. Otherwise the same. So 8 carbons, all fluorines. That's perfluorooctane sulfonic acid. That's what I'm going to talk about mostly today, because it's the one we most are encountering, at least in dairy and meat products and eggs when we find them, and sometimes vegetables. The PFOA and some of the carboxylates are ones we're seeing, I would say, more often in vegetables. Take that PFAS, take away 2 carbons, you've now got 6. You have perfluorohexane sulfonic acid, abbreviated PFHXS. Take away another 2, you've got 4, PFBS, for butane sulfonic acid. And there are, in the same way, 7, 5, 10, 12 carbon versions of these as well. And then for these, there's also what we would call branched. I'm not going to go into that, but you should just know there's a reason why it's a big family. But these are the ones I'm going to mostly talk about today. And again, mostly this specific one. So now let's switch to a good way of knowing what's going on in the environment from all sources, whether it's water or food, dust in the home, air, etc., is to measure what's in our bodies. And CDC, through the National Report on Human Exposure to Environmental Chemicals, I provide the link below, has been tracking these levels in our bodies with samples of the US population, adults 12 and older, and for quite some time, going back to 1999, 2000, and about every 2 years, they publish an update. It takes time to collect the samples, analyze the samples in the laboratory, analyze the results statistically. So that's why there's a lag between what we know at any time and what the current date is. I would expect the 1920 data to be coming out fairly soon. And one of the things you'll notice, especially with PFAS, is how much it has decreased over the past 20 or so years, which is good news. I've yet to read anything that says exactly why we've had this decrease, but presumably it's because PFAS and PFOA have been voluntarily withdrawn from use in a lot of products, especially food contact products. It's hard to think that any of us change out our couches or carpets or Gore-Tex jackets all that frequently. So the most likely explanation is getting this out of food contact products and therefore food we eat, in order for it to respond as rapidly as we have seen in this picture. For PFOA has also dropped. It was never as high as PFAS, but that's gone down by about a half over this time. And here are some of the other ones that are at much lower levels in our bodies. And the trends continue to be going down. So now let's talk a little bit about what we know about these chemicals in food supply. FDA has now done 4 rounds, I believe, or 3 rounds of testing of the national food supply. They do this as part of their total diet study collection. They have various regions that they have kind of a calendar for when they go and sample to try to be looking at ways that the food in the US food supply can vary seasonally. They also have some sampling which is reflective of foods that are in the food supply that do not change seasonally, and they sample those all around the Kansas City area. Trying to think, so there's a 2019 data set, a 2020 and a 2021 data set, if I remember that correctly. Generally, they're sampling over 100 different food items, breads, dairy, meats, produce, etc. Some cases it's processed food as well. And in each one of those surveys, they're usually only finding somewhere between 1 and 3 food items that have any detectable levels of PFAS. And in the foods that they've been looking at, the ones that seem to pop up of having any measurable levels of PFAS, and most of it is PFAS, are the ones that I put on the left of this slide. So tilapia, ground turkey, catfish, cod, shrimp, fish sticks, canned tuna, and protein powder. And sometimes they find these, sometimes they don't. But in all cases, when they find them, the levels are quite low, generally under 0.5 nanogram per gram. That's the same as a part per billion. And FDA says on its site that all these levels are believed to be below any sort of health benchmarks that they have for thinking about how much is too much in foods. So that's sort of when FDA looks at this from a national perspective, and foods that are in the national food supply, their take is there's not much that they're finding, and when they find it, it's generally low. So if you read their material, you'll see they have confidence that the food supply in the US is safe. As Nancy mentioned, her agency has now done 3 rounds of retail milk sampling in the state. Their approach has been to try to capture all producers in the state, broad consumer retail experience and geography with the sampling, focus on milk produced in the state. Sampling rounds now 2019, 2020, 21. And from those 3 sampling rounds to date, representing over 60 samples from the 3 rounds, we've only had 1 retail milk sample that had PFAS levels above 50 nanograms per liter. That's parts per trillion. I'll explain more about why I'm using that reference point. But that reference point, well, to just give you sort of a sense right now, that's what we think FDA is currently using internally as a screening level for PFAS in milk, at which they would begin to potentially have some concern. So we've already had 1, and as Nancy mentioned, that one was able to be traced back to a single dairy farm that unfortunately had very high milk levels on the range of 20 to 30,000 part per trillion nanogram per liter in that farm. But by the time it got into the retail, it was actually a retail milk sample of only about 60. So that's our experience with sampling of retail milk through the state to date. Nancy mentioned we are finding some localized cases where we are encountering farms with elevated levels. When you find that, it does not mean that's the end of the dairy farm. So in this case, I'm showing you a success story, if you will, of a single dairy farm. When we first learned of PFAS in the milk, this farm had a level as high as 800 part per trillion. And you can see how it's gone down over time through hard work by the farmer and state agencies getting involved, along with Maine Cooperative Extension and MAFCA to try to problem solve. This was an organic farm. And through a combination of shifting what fields the dairy herd would graze on, sourcing haylage from other fields that did not have contamination, switching over fields that did have contamination to crops that take up less, and we actually have study research plots on these farms to try to help get more information on that, and treating well water that had low levels. Wasn't the big determination of what was going on in the milk, but they nonetheless spent a lot of money to have those wells but with treatment systems on. And they've even cleared a lot of new land that will give them acreage for haylage that's never been land applied. So the long-term prognosis for this farm is very good, but you can see how over time the levels have gone from 80 down to now just under 100. They've been as low as 50. These little spikes are showing you that when a farm first encounters this, there can be challenges because you've only got the food that's available. So this is wintertime. They're having to use the food in the bunkers they have. If you get into a part of a bunker where the haylage has higher levels, you can see a spike in milk, then it starts to go down again. And a lot of this noise is also the farmers still having to cycle in animals that have been, heifers that have been freshened. So they're had a calf, they're now producing milk again, but they may have had a period of exposure, and until they start producing milk, they don't have that big elimination pathway. So they may come into the herd a bit elevated and give little spikes down here. But that's all taken care of now. So again, the long-term prognosis is levels should continue to drop, and we're all very pleased by that, and kudos to the farmer. I want to talk a little bit about how we decide or determine how much is too much in foods, just so you're generally aware of that methodology. We are trying to do things as we understand FDA would be. Our preference would be to use FDA action levels, but FDA does not have a single action level for any food, for any PFAS that they are willing to make available and stand behind. Again, they have internal numbers, but they do not have numbers that they have put out there. Again, this gets back to them not seeing much in the national food supply, so not feeling like they have a need to go through that process, but that leaves it to states like Maine and Michigan and some others, New Mexico, to have to come up with their own. So it's a pretty simple equation we're using. You just have a toxicity value that we go and look to federal agencies for, whether it's EPA, FDA, or the US Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. You need a consumption rate. So that's how much of that food item, whether it's milk or water or eggs or beef or spinach, that people eat. And FDA and others have some great survey databases you can go in. So we're actually mining those survey data for what people actually do eat. And then we're usually using an upper percentile rate consumption, and we look at children versus adults, et cetera. And then sometimes, but not always, you will try to account for background exposure. So if I've indicated we've all got these levels in our bodies, that translates into a certain daily dose that we're all getting. And if you want, you can try to account for that in this. So you think of the new food you're eating combined with what we're getting from other foods, and try to factor that into how much is too much in food. So here's an example of what the milk number would be as we understand what FDA is currently doing internally and where we will be moving to. Nancy mentioned that the current number we have derived back in circa 2016, 2017, something around there, is 210 nanograms per liter. FDA has indicated they are no longer using that EPA toxicity value. They are now using ones published by the US Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry in 2021. So for PFAS, that's the number, 2 nanogram per kilogram per day. You use a 90th percentile milk consumption rate for a child averaged over 0 to 6 years. That's what that number in the denominator is, the 0.04 liters per kilogram per day. FDA does not account for background exposure. So if we don't do it that way, you end up with a number of about 50 nanograms per liter. Remember in the prior slide, I pointed out that to date in retail milk, we've only found one sample with a level above 50 nanogram per liter, and that was traced back to one farm, as again, Nancy mentioned. So you could do this exact same calculation for pretty much any food for which you can go into the survey data and mine and get consumption rates. So to date, we've done it with milk, with beef, and we've done it with sport caught fish. We've done a provisional one with eggs, and we are currently working on one for spinach, and then we'll go through adding others as there's needs to do so. So now in the last couple of slides, what I want to do is give you a sense of what we're learning about these uptake of these chemicals. I'm going to focus on 2, PFAS, so the 8-carbon sulfonic acid, and PFOA, the 8-carbon carboxylic acid variations of PFAS. And I don't want you to focus too much on what the numbers mean on the y-axis, which is over here, because different studies determine or compute the transfer factor in different ways. The transfer factor is just a ratio of what's in the soil to what's in the plant. But sometimes they do it based on wet weight of the plant. Sometimes they do it on dry weight. So again, don't focus on the absolute numbers. What I want you to focus on is just the relative height of these bars, which is a measure of how much uptake into the plant. And mostly I want you to focus on is how it can be really different for different types of plants. So you'll look at things like lettuce and celery, and this is true for other greens. You can see appreciable uptake from the soil into the plant. But fruits, for reasons we don't fully understand, do not have hardly any uptake into the fruit. So here you can just look and see how small the bars are for peas and tomatoes grown in potted plant studies with known contaminated soil. And you can see how little uptake there is relative to lettuce and celery and versus radish. Here's another example from a different published study, and I'm giving you the links below to the published studies if you want to get into the weeds no pun intended. This is giving you a sense for carrots. So you can see a fair amount of uptake for carrots into the green vegetative above ground portion, but very little into either the carrots themselves or the carrot peelings. Similarly with cucumbers, again, in the sort of fruit category, you can see plenty uptake into the vegetative portion, but not into the edible part of the cucumbers themselves. Same with potatoes, not lots. You can see appreciable uptake into the vegetative portion, very, very little uptake into either the potatoes or potato peels. We are starting to get some of our own data from farms. And what we're seeing here with potatoes is similar to what we've seen in at least several places that we've now sampled, that despite having some fairly high levels in the soils, we're seeing very little uptake into potatoes. We've seen very little uptake into melons. And then here we're looking at grains. So again, you can see uptake into the corn straw. That's going to be the stalk, the leaves, the husk, tassels, etc., but very little into the ears, and even less into the corn kernels themselves. We have some of our own field data now on this. We're seeing the same sort of thing. Oats, wheat, and grain. Oats and wheat, and I think there's data now out for rye. Again, you can see it uptake into the straw, but very little uptake into the actual edible grain that people are using to make various products. So, and again, we've seen just our first data on this from a farm, and we're seeing the same sort of pattern, very little uptake into the grains, again, despite having some fairly elevated soil levels. So that's all I've got for you today, to just kind of give you an overview. There's lots we could talk about. We have a lot of field studies, not a lot, but we certainly have field studies underway looking at the plant uptake. We're learning a lot as we sample at more farms. There's more coming out in the literature all the time. We've got work going with our agricultural colleagues. I'm trying to see if there's a way to come up with a live animal test for beef animals to know what's could be present in the tissue before you have to slaughter the animal. Some chicken studies underway as well. So happy to answer questions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. All right. Thank you all for your presentations. There's certainly a real interest across our industries to learn more. We appreciate your insight and your willingness to provide all the information that's being done at the state level, and also providing information from a scientific approach as well. And so I'll go ahead and pin all of our presenters for this morning, and we can take a few questions and answers. And we certainly won't be able to get to them all based on the great information you all were able to provide to us this morning, but in an effort to address everyone's questions, we'll share those questions with you all and work to get some answers back out to all of our attendees. In addition, we'll share the recording and the presentation so that folks have all of the resources to revisit any of this information. So I will go ahead and pin some of that and go ahead and get started with some questions. The first question was referring to whether or not anything is actually PFAS free. Can it truly be PFAS free or PFAS clean? And so I'm not sure who could speak to that best, or potentially multiple people can work to answer that one.
I'm going to defer to the toxicologist.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a hard claim to make because first, it's a little bit of you only know what you can measure, and we can only measure so low. So we can test things and say everything is below the ability to measure it, to detect it, because we have detection limits for these things, and we can say it's below those detection limits. And those detection limits are currently quite low, generally in the part per billion, part per trillion level, depending on what you're testing for. So I think at most what you can say is we've tested and we can't detect it. Then I think it's knowing something about where the product's coming from and what the potential is for exposure. So if you go out and just take a soil sample anywhere, you can find trace levels of these chemicals. So that's just unfortunate, but it's not unlike our experiences with DDT, dioxins, PCBs. if you use chemicals that are slow to break down in the environment and you put them out in the general commerce, you are going to find them pretty much everywhere you look. And as the instruments improve and we can detect lower levels, you're going to find them. So I think at most what you can say is either no PFAS was used in the product, Susanne can speak more to that, or you can say that we measured and we didn't detect anything.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Smith. You just summed that up really nicely, and I would say that that is one of the things that the PFAS in products law aims to do, is to try to find out where PFAS is in all consumer products.
All right, I'm going to kind of combine a couple questions here to try to kill two birds with one stone. First, an attendee asked, do we know why PFAS levels are so high in the sludge to begin with? And then later on, there was a question that referred to farm sites with wood ash and whether or not what kind of factor that is besides biosolids.
Okay, so I'll start with the wood ash question. Typically, we don't consider that to be a source of PFAS. They are on the map because we have been trying to be as transparent as possible. We haven't had a chance to refine fully the map that's on the website. It is something where people have reached out to us to talk about that, and after reviewing the data, in some cases we have removed some of that information where we feel like the sludge that was applied, if it's wood ash or some other source, it might not be appropriate to be on the map. So that is something we're still currently trying to refine and improve our mapping system. And the first question was inputs to determine, where we think PFAS is coming from. We haven't done a complete forensic analysis of that, so we don't have the data yet for that. But I would say, there are definitely some areas for sure we know where it's coming from. It is coming from wastewater treatment. So anything that goes into a wastewater treatment plant, it could be from an industrial input, could be like paper mills or other industrial users. It could be from consumer products. I mean, remember, every time you wash your Teflon pan, that water goes down into the wastewater treatment plant and more PFAS is going in there. Septage, so any of you who have a home septage tank likely is going to have PFAS in it. That's, again, sometimes those septage tanks, when they're pumped out, sometimes they go to the landfill, sometimes they go to a wastewater treatment plant. So again, that's added PFAS that goes there. Sometimes landfill leachate goes to a wastewater treatment plant. And we know that landfill leachate has, consumer products that have been thrown out, as well as all sorts of products. And so again, PFAS is there as well. So it's hard to identify exactly where the bulk of it's coming from at this point in time. Hopefully we'll get to that point and we'll have a better understanding of that as we move forward with our investigation.
All right, thank you for those answers. We do have a few remaining questions, but unfortunately we are running a bit late on our timeline. And I know we actually, most of us are jumping over to some legislative hearings that address some bills that are speaking to make some changes for PFAS. So certainly want to be respectful of folks' time. And so thank you all for asking the questions, and we will proactively work to get you some answers to some of those outstanding questions. And so do you want to do one quick plug? We are having a companion webinar on sustainable packaging scheduled on March 29th. So we'll be having some additional discussion under our Food for Thought Forum webinar series. And so again, thank you so much, Director McBrady, Director Miller, and Dr. Smith for your time today. We really appreciate it. And again, just want to thank our series sponsors, Hannaford Supermarkets, Poland Spring, Shaw's Supermarkets, Associated Grocers of New England, Pizzuto's, Altria, and Pepsi. And thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time, and we'll wrap things up this morning. Everyone have a great day. Thanks so much.